I think that's a really great segue into the last part of the conversation, which is about incidental and intentional exposure. And so how they're all related, before we get back to your example, Jared, is that in general, neurologically, we're trying to, after we prepare for the anxious moment and know what our plan is going to be, we're trying to embrace uncertainty because we want to use the moment of anxiety as an opportunity to show ourselves that we're not basically that either we're not afraid, or even if we're afraid, we can still do the things that we value. And this type of learning is state dependent. So you can't read yourself or talk yourself into relating to anxiety differently. You've got to actually get anxious and then show yourself that you can handle it, you can relate to it differently. So that you could say the same for a behavior change. Any kind of behavior change is going to give you a little bit of anticipation, like, can I really do the thing that I committed to? And the only way that you can teach yourself and get that experiential confidence is to actually show up to the commitment that you've made. So with that in mind, there's things you can do to make commitments more likely to be commitments that you can keep. And that way you'll stay motivated and accountable to yourself or other people over time. And so when you're thinking about intentional or incidental exposure and intentional practice would be intentionally seeking out things that are anxiety provoking for you. So you get to practice using your strategy to relate to it effectively. Incidental exposure and practice are times where you just happen to have anxiety show up in everyday life and you still want to practice your strategy, but it's kind of like maintaining functioning during incidental exposure is also really important. So in general, we're just thinking about it as these types of practices are the only ways to teach our primitive brain that not only is anticipatory anxiety only a feeling, not a fact or prediction, but also when we get to that anxious moment, we can tolerate it and thrive in spite of it. So with that in mind, Scout, can you go first with your intentional and incidental practice related to the uncertainties that you just described?
Sure. So with respect to relationship with CD, I'm married, so my life is really kind of like a walking exposure. So there wasn't a lot of need to do intentional exposures when I was working on it because they would just happen so often. So a lot of it was learning when I got the fight or flight feeling, which I would get on and off all day long. Would be to continue doing what I was doing, not tense up or brace or try to figure out if the feeling means anything, but to kind of just keep on doing what it was that I was doing and kind of go towards my values. One way that I could add an intentional exposure to that, at first I didn't do this because I was struggling so much just with maintaining functioning with the incidental exposures. But now that I'm better, sometimes if I do get a fight or flight feeling with the theme being about my relationship, I'll intentionally add on to it. So I might say something like, yeah, maybe I don't really know if I actually love my wife. And then I'll keep doing what it is that I was doing before. So I try to make it a little bit worse.
What's that like to talk about?
It feels good that I've managed to get so much better because I for a long time had just a really hard time with the thoughts. I was really fused to them and kind of felt like I was stuck in a situation that wasn't going to get better and that I wasn't going to have this attitude, the kind of willingness attitude. And so the fact that sometimes I am willing to do a little bit more, it feels good. It feels, I guess since I was an athlete, it kind of feels like, like I scored a goal or something like that.
That's a great attitude. Thanks so much for sharing that. Sophie?
I think certain things make exposures, certain types of things make certain exposures better. And I think for me, what's tricky is when you're like being bombarded by like incidental exposures, so much that it's like you can't pace them out and like kind of like let yourself recover from the sensations from incidental exposures before you have more. Like I found like certain triggers I've had, like contamination and just things like that, I guess, like driving, locks in the stove, things like that that I've had. It was like pretty easy for me to like plan exposures around those and then carry them out. And I found those to be like tremendously easier to get over than things like, you know, harming someone through my work, because every day I'm like, there's so many incidental exposures through like decisions I make, and you know, I don't have control over the patients that come in and how they present and how they interact with me. And I think it was really hard for me at the beginning of while I was working to tolerate how much exposure that was. It just was like a fire hose, you know? And I think it's just tricky to plan, you know, kind of like what Scott was saying. It's like once you kind of get your bearings with how much exposure there is, then I think it's easier to plan intentional exposures around that. But I still find it tricky to get to that place with this certain content area, like at work, to be able to do intentional exposures. But I do know what those exposures need to be. And like kind of like I was talking about it before, those are the things that I know what I'm sensitized around. So that's when I plan the intentional exposures.
Yeah, that's great. You're showing a lot of self-awareness. Do you feel self-compassionate about how your process is going to go, given that it's going to take some time for you to kind of get in the groove of what's helpful to you?
Yeah, I think self-compassion is definitely hard for me to um, get to a lot of times. I think just because I tend to be a pretty harsh critic on myself. But at least I like conceptually understand what needs to happen like in this process for me to get to a place where I could be okay with how much exposure is happening. So maybe that's that understanding of self-compassion.
Yeah, I absolutely think it is. And also to your fear around how do I know that my mental health isn't going to deteriorate in a way that will impair my life. I think as long as you have a plan, even if you're having difficulty executing the plan, you kind of know where you are. And then there's less uncertainty about like how things are going to go. Do you agree with me on that?
I do. I think that can also be scary though, because you know where you are and you know the power is kind of only your own, if that makes sense.
Yeah. There's definitely a like do the there's kind of the serenity. It reminds me of the serenity challenge. So trying to take control of the things that you have control over, and then also surrender when there's things that you can't control. But it's challenging to do both. Larissa, can you go next?
Sure. I appreciate everything everybody is saying, and I can relate somewhat to everything everybody's saying. And then I feel like I've lost my train of thought. But as far as like when I intentionally want to do an exposure, I like today, I know when I go for that vaccine, I can just anticipate that I'm going to have that anxiety just flood over me to the point where I get frightened that I'll get a fever, and then they won't want to give me the vaccine. And so looking at that as an opportunity to just say, okay, I can do this. Take a deep breath, you know, do what I can to relax at the moment. When I start, I think sometimes with me, when the intrusive thoughts about what could happen start flooding over me, it's hard for me to focus. So I'll just focus on what I'm doing right now. Just continue to stand here. You know, I'm okay. I'll get through this. I've been through it before. Looking back at things I've gotten through that I thought maybe I wouldn't be able to, and try to remember that. But I think like even now, the whoosh of anxiety is coming over me. You know, uh, am I even saying the right thing or doing the right question? And I think I just have to remember that I'm losing my train of thought. Maybe can you?
So that it's just a feeling. So that this is okay. Whatever you're feeling right now is okay. And right now is an opportunity to just have compassion on, like treat yourself with compassion because you're just having a feeling.
Yeah, I think what that was about is in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, what's intentional, what's incidental? Sometimes I get confused of which is which, and but it leaves me with the feeling of anxiety, or I'll say the wrong thing. But and when Sophie was talking about being compassionate, I have to remember that because it's hard to be compassionate when I don't when I'm feeling this way,
Great.
or
Yeah.
I'm saying. So I have to just say it's all good. I'm okay.
Totally. Yeah. So sometimes that kind of framework of intentional being things that you seek out and incidental being things that happen to you can be helpful for you to think about what's happening and what you want your strategy to be. But if we always just think about the strategy is it's okay to be anxious, and in the moment of anxiety, we're trying to allow it to be here, like to observe what's happening, to allow it to be here and not do anything to try to make it go away, then you're always doing it right, as long as you're trying to accept what's occurring. So thank you for that example.
So this would be this would be an incidental. What I'm feeling now, what I didn't expect to feel. That's
Exactly.
an incidental.
Yep.
Okay, but
Good
my
example.
intention is to go at it, move forward.
Exactly. Thank you.
Okay.
And Jared, can you talk about your either incidental or intentional exposure?
Yeah, with incidental would be more with my cycling routine, with my bike riding, and with intentional, I would have to say, just going back to my school subject, I remember just like first starting out, the semester at my, at grad school, and before that, I dropped out of law school, and it was just like a really demoralizing experience just because I felt like I worked really hard and just, the results didn't really express that. And, the anxiety, the anticipatory anxiety and all that was just like really starting to come up. And especially when I entered the class, that nervousness, that first time meeting everybody, anxiety just really started to play a role. And then there's this thing called class participation, and I never felt like I was a great class participator. And so this was like I just felt like it was a huge moment for me. I know it wasn't for like a lot of other people. But for me, it just felt like, okay, this is now your chance to like be able to, maybe this is a good opportunity to just kind of like talk, because now you're working at something that you want to do. You're in an environment that makes you feel a little bit more confident. Let's just see how it goes. Just don't really think about the consequences and the results that would happen right afterwards. And just go with it. And it really did help. And it was very much a reinforcing atmosphere during that time period. But when it comes to incidental, it would be like my bike riding. I would go out, the anxiety would kick in. And, let's say that I fall or do something stupid. And that would be, I can't really think of one just right at the top of my head, but, then there would be like another spike of anxiety just because of that kind of awkward movement that I did with my bike. So for me, there was a lot of moments like that. It just sounds very trivial when I talk about it. Like it's not a big deal, but for me, just because it was like an everyday thing, just like how people thought about me, it doesn't even matter if I knew you, if you were a stranger, it just really played a role and impacted, I think my life to keep avoiding, a lot of the things that I wanted to kind of do. So yeah.
Yeah.
Not thinking about the consequences was like a huge help for me. Just to get back.
Both of those are really great examples of, in both cases, you expected that the anxiety was going to show up, and then you had a strategy for allowing yourself to relate to the anxiety effectively so that it didn't escalate. So thank you for those examples. Those are great examples. So in awareness of our time, we're going to end here. Thanks so much for listening and for embracing your uncertainty. See you soon.